little, got to be somewhere in the middle, like the Goldilocks syndrome. But she had to try everybody's best before she found
Kind of support that, but yeah, do a lot of art and craft work.
We'll get you on the list. Yeah.
Do a lot of projects for the hospital.
Yes, ma'am.
Say it looks like that's great.
I am thrilled that today's lecture features Tim Barnwell. Please raise your hand if you are familiar with Tim Barnwell's work. Yeah. He has his hand raised as well. Tim is an incredible photographer based out of Asheville. He has artwork in a variety of museums, including the High Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum, the Mint Museum. He's also a really thoughtful documentarian of Southern Appalachia. There is a long and rich history about photography in the Appalachian region, and I'm always happy to talk about perceptions and portrayals of this part of the world. But I'm just here to say Tim's work is really important, and then it shows this place without a whole lot of editorial comment. Tim became involved in the Cashiers area starting in 2012 when he began documenting the faces and places of the Cashiers Valley. Please raise your hand if you have that book, Faces and Places of Cashiers Valley. Great. I am partial to it. It is a CHS publication. It offers a really rich history of this area. If you do not have that book, we can solve that problem. After today's talk, if you head over to that table, you can purchase a book, and then Tim is generous enough to sign it. I just want to say thank you to Tim, who has not only taken the photographs in this book, but he conducted these oral histories. And through today's talk, I hope you'll see how photography is intrinsically linked to communicating with someone, forming a relationship with the person you're making a portrait of. So thank you for being here today, and mark your calendar. We have another Mountain Heritage lecture this very week. Our August lecture is this Saturday, August 2nd at 3 p.m. We're bringing in the Director of Interpretation from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and he's going to come and talk about Monticello and the historic narratives Monticello has told over the last century and where they are now. So please, if you plan to come to that, give the library a call just so we get your name on a list. We anticipate it being a pretty packed house on Saturday. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Tim Barnwell.
All right, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Good, because I'm not very good with it not being amplified. So I wish everybody welcome, and I think I talked to many of you on your way in. If I missed somebody, I'm sorry, but I'm glad you can make it today and brave the hot weather or rainy weather or whatever it's going to be for the next 15 minutes, and we'll check outside again and see how it's changed. So if you have questions during the program, just raise your hand and feel free to, you don't have to wait till the end if you got a question, because you may forget or it may apply to some particular image or something like that. I'll be glad to answer anything from aesthetic questions to technical questions for those that have an interest in the photography end of it. But I don't want to make it photocentric as far as technical kinds of things, because I don't put a whole lot of emphasis on that. I think once you learn your craft and kind of get that under your belt, then it really becomes much more about the aesthetics of what you're trying to do and the project that you're working on, and how you present that and how you present the people that you're working with. And so each different project that I do, I try to kind of create a different look, because I want to be excited about going out and doing the work. I don't want it to be routine. I don't want to go approach it as if I've done it before. Because I want to be excited when I come back home at the end of the day to see what I've got, and that's still what keeps me going, is to try to push myself, challenge myself to do something different, but at the same time honor the people that I'm photographing. And I do a lot of commercial photography to make a living. I have a studio in Asheville for the last, since the 1980s anyway. Ran a photography school for 8 years back in the early 80s. and had guest instructors come in and teach their specialty, and a lot of the people became kind of mentors of mine, and I'll show you some of their work in a minute. And so it's been a long kind of process, but what I enjoy doing is more kind of editorial type of work, which is what you're going to see today, which is my book projects and things of that nature, which range from documentation of Appalachian culture to travel and tourism kinds of things, and guidebooks and that kind of stuff. But the Cashier Project's really close to my heart. I spent a lot of time over here. I actually grew up, I was born in Bryson City. My parents were school teachers. They met at Western back after World War II and got married. And they taught in Bryson City, and then in Franklin, we lived there, and then in Marshall, and then eventually in Asheville, which is where I live today with my wife, Catherine, who's here. And so, anyway, that's kind of a little bit about what I do. Today, I have a commercial studio where I photograph a lot of art and craft work for people. I do business portraits, things like that. Pretty much the whole gambit except for weddings. That's the one thing I don't do. If you do those, then that's every weekend and, for the rest of your life. So that's one thing that I kind of stayed away from. But short of that, I do a lot of travel and tourism kind of things, brochures you see, magazine articles. I worked for Biltmore State for 20-something years as a freelancer doing coverage for their brochures and seeing every part of the house. And most people have never been into, even with the back tours that you can do today. So, but the fine art photography is something I really have done just on my own. I use the commercial photography that I do to kind of pay for the cost of doing that. Today I also have a YouTube channel called The Face of Appalachia, which is named after my first book on Appalachian culture. And we've got 40 episodes up as of this week on traditional Appalachian culture. So if you ever watch YouTube, you can go to The Face of Appalachia and check out some of those episodes too. So the Faces and Places of Cashiers, if I can figure out the technology. So here's all of my different books. I've done ones on culture of Appalachians, the 3 Appalachian theme books here, The Face of Appalachia, On Earth's Fur Brow, Hands in Harmony. And you can see the original first edition of The Faces and Places, which now, of course, the second edition is out that they have here today. And then the Blue Ridge Parkway Vistas and Great Smoky Mountains Vistas, which has the unique component of identifying what you see from different overlooks along the parkway and in the Smokies. And then a book on Savannah and Charleston architecture in that area, and then one on shrimping and fishing on the Carolina-Georgia coast, things like that. I've done a lot of other books that I'm not quite the author of, but I was principal photographer for, but these are basically what I've been doing over my career, especially since about 2000 when The Face of Appalachia first came out. So, my influences, everybody, I think, if there's one photographer that everybody knows, it's Ansel Adams. And growing up as a photographer, he was kind of the person that everybody looked to for landscape photography. He did do portrait photography. You'll find that in different places, but primarily he's all the way through into the 70s and 80s. Probably photographed every president since the 50s, worked for Time and Life, a lot of different magazines. And he kind of did what is considered environmental portraits, which is what I enjoy doing. And that is putting the person in a situation, in the environment, either that they created or somehow relates to them. That's opposed to a traditional studio photography or people like Richard Avedon that went out and would take a white background, even out west, and to put everybody against a white background, that kind of separated them from that environment. So it's a different approach, and it's one that I like because I think when I put people in an environment, it helps you figure out more about that person. In most cases, maybe it's a farmer who has lived on that place for 50 years and built every structure on it and carved out the land to fit their needs and all. And so what I like to do is approach that, and that's the way I did for this particular book, is also putting people in the environment of where they either live or work. This is one of Arthur Miller, playwright, in New York by Arnold Newman, another one by Max Ernst, painter, and you can see kind of he has the ability to, where the environment is just as important as the person in the photograph in many cases. They contribute to each other, so it's not just a facial shot. And I think that's also important for the work that I do because we are inundated today with photographs of celebrities. Everywhere you look, it's movie stars and things like that, and magazine covers, and you recognize many of them because you're constantly being fed this publicity kind of stuff. but you don't really know that person. You have an idea of who they are from movies they've appeared in or something you might read, but it really is it's a fabricated world that's being presented to you. And what I like to do is kind of get beyond that and try to find people that you don't know, but make you interested in them, and then show them in a way that will create an environment where you understand more about that person simply from looking at the photograph and me not having to describe everything to you. Because in most of my exhibits, I'm not standing there at the photograph. Imogen Cunningham is another one that I admired a lot. She was a very prolific photographer, contemporary of Ansel Adams, but she did almost exclusively portrait photography. And in fact, she had a book called After 90. There's all these photographs she made of people that were over the age of 90, taken after she was over the age of 90. So she had a long, productive career like that. And this is one of her father. I have this print and also one of her mother that she made. And during the 1930s, during the Depression, the FSA group, the Farm Security Administration, hired a group of photographers to go out across the country and document the Depression and kind of the recovery. And that became a big project. Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, a lot of people went out and traveled around the country with their cameras and documented a lot in the South, a lot in the West. This was done by Walker Evans, shot down in Alabama. Another one of his interior shots in Alabama of a church there. And the one that you've probably all seen, the classic mother and her children in the Depression era kind of photograph, was kind of the symbol of the Depression, really became that way, done by Dorothea Lange. Another one by her of a family in California. And then one of my mentors, George Tice, he just passed away in January, but he helped me get my first book published and been a good friend and mentor to me for decades. And this is one of his photographs from the Amish series that he did. He spent a lot of time in New York and New Jersey photographing kind of industrial urban landscapes that he called them. This is one of the ones from his book called Urban Landscapes. So he kind of made an art out of photographing scenes that most of us would pass by, scenes of urban life, not bucolic farm life and things like that. And he had a way of, taught me to appreciate telephone lines because, normally I'm trying to crop all those out of my photographs, but he would embrace things like that and make them part of the composition. And it's a real kind of eye-opening experience. And he had probably 20 books out, I guess, over his career. So the project started here when I had an exhibit at the Asheville Art Museum for my Hands in Harmony book, which is on traditional music and handcrafts. And several people from the Historical Society came over and we had lunch after the walkthrough talk. And they said that they wanted to do something like that, but with people from Cashiers Valley. And so we just talked it over, and I came out and kind of did some scouting. We went around and met some people, and so we kind of formulated the idea of trying to do, they originally wanted to do primarily buildings, and I kind of convinced them to let's include people too, because if you want to try to engender any interest or emotional impact, having people in the photograph is always going to do that more than just structures and things like that. So we came up with this idea of doing both people and structures and how the relationship between those. And so in many of the photographs, it's people either in a house that they live in or back at a place where they grew up or something that's important to their family history, things like that. And then the oral history part. They wanted, since all three of my Appalachian books have an oral history component in the back, they wanted to do something like that. And what that involves is normally what I would do is I would go out and interview people before I took the picture, because the Face of Appalachia book, it was all shot with a 4x5 view camera, which is when we put your head under the hood and the image is upside down and backwards and everything's mechanical and manual, and it's very painstaking. Most people just use it for landscape photography, like Ansel Adams, people like that use large format cameras. But the advantage is it gives you a negative that's 4x5 inches, so you can make very large prints from that. So that's how I would approach it. So it's not something where I walk up with a camera around my neck and try to talk to them. So it's really the last thing that I would do is ask someone if I could take their picture. And normally I would know what their response was going to be before I asked, or I just wouldn't ask if I thought it wasn't the right time. And it's just a process of learning people and kind of getting them comfortable with you. The other thing that doing the oral history interview does in all of these projects, I think, is it lets the person get to know me, I get to know them, and so I observe how they sit, how they stand, what's a normal expression, things like that. Because as soon as the camera comes out, we all pose, right? Stand up against the wall, smile, and and it's not natural. So what I'm saying, oh, no, come back over, sit, where you were, put your hand back up here like it was, or something like that, or at least be responsive to when they do look natural. And the one thing about the view camera was that it took so long to set up and get it set up that people were just bored at that point, and they just kind of gave up and started looking natural again. So, but I don't use that today. Today I use what's considered a 35 millimeter digital camera. So all these images that you'll see today were shot in color with a digital camera and then converted to black and white, and then the prints were made that are over at the High Hampton at the Zachary Talbert House, and all those are made from digital negatives, as you would say. Okay. So that was the idea, was to go ahead and do oral history. So they would start out by giving me a list of questions because I didn't know the person. They kind of directed me as what they wanted to know about their family history or something like that. And we'd use that as a jumping off point. And I'd usually do maybe a 45-minute interview with a person with a tape recorder so that they would have that interview. For the book, we later edited that down to kind of just a page of the essence of it. And then I would take the photograph. Now, in this case, people knew I was coming to do this, so they knew I wanted to take a photograph. It's not like I had to ask permission or things like that, so it was the dynamics were a little bit different. But I met very few people who want their picture made unless they're under the age of 10, so. But fortunately, they allowed me to do that. So in practice, it meant that what they did was pick out the people and places that they wanted, and I would go to that situation and do the interview and then try to come up with something there that would give them what they need, which is a portrait of the person and or portraits of the structures, which is basically how I consider the building pictures as kind of just portraits as well. So we started out as it was a one-off project. We were going to pick 8 people and places and do that. It was not a book project. There was no vision of that at the time. It was just, we want you to come and we're going to do 8 people and places in Cashiers Valley. And so I came and kind of went over what some of their choices were, and we went back and forth on that and went and looked at some of the places and came up with that. And that's what I did. So I did the oral history interview and then did the portrait and then provided them with a 16 by 20 print that they could display. And that was kind of going to be the end of it. But the next year they decided that they really liked what we had gotten and wanted to do more, and they came up with a budget to do it. And I came back and spent, usually I would do 2 people in one day, sometimes 1 person in a day. And I'd drive over from Asheville, where I have my studio today, and I would spend the day here and photograph and interview, and then go back home and produce the work, transcribe the interviews, make the prints, that sort of thing, send them proofs and all. Then in 2013, the Bascom over in Highlands hired me to come do the same thing over there. So I did 8 people in places over there. And then in 2014 came back in and did 8 more people in places. And then kind of at some point, I said, you've got enough material now to do a book. There's really enough here between all the portraits, all the building pictures, all the oral histories. You can make a nice book out of this. But to make it interesting to the general public, maybe you would want to add a history of cashiers, kind of broaden it out, give people a sense of place. You definitely want to, tell your story of the Cashiers Historical Society, what your mission is, how you achieve that, and to try to get support for that. And all of that came together into the first book, which came out in 2019, and then the new editions in 2024. But the first ones were published in just these little catalogs, and this was a phase 1 picture of this guy named Howard Alley in the Summer Chapel photograph I did there. And then the second one, phase 2, came out with people, kind of cropped pictures of the people that I did for that series. And then phase 3, kind of a similar kind of thing with more pictures and stuff. So the book idea was, take all of this, put it together. I edited down the oral histories into a cogent, like 1-page thing that could be displayed opposite the photograph, where you could read about the person. In my Face of Appalachia and Hands in Harmony honors for our Bow books, they are full-page photographs, about 100 pages in each book, that are just the photographs and nothing else. And in the back, there's thumbnails that have the oral histories with them, so you can reference that. If you want to look at it as a photography book, enjoy the portraits, you can do that. If you want to learn more and read about the person, their story of their life, or something about what they're doing in the photograph, then you can go to the back and read that. In this case, we decided to come up with something different. We paired them, right across from each other, and I think it worked out very nicely. And then they hired a book designer down in Atlanta, and she put together a really beautiful design and came up with this wonderful book that you can see today. This is the original cover, the first edition, came out in 2019. And this is a couple of guys who've been lifelong friends. You can kind of tell that just from their casualness with each other and comfortable. One guy's cleaning his fingernails, another one's telling me this great story. And they were sitting on this little four-wheeler that one of them rode over to visit the other one at their farm, and they spent a lot of time together, farming together over their lifetime. And on the second edition, we decided on a different cover to make it stand out as something different, change the color, picked a different photograph of another couple here, John Warren, and his wife passed away a few years ago now, but I think John came to one of the openings we had a year or two ago when the book was released, and actually played some music for us. And then I also threw in photographs from the area, because when you're going to do a book, you need a lot more illustration kind of stuff. So things that aren't about the history, about the historical society, that aren't historical photographs. What is it that kind of rounds out the community and gives you more of a feeling of a sense of place? And so I went to Silver Run Falls, different places around the green and different things to kind of give you more of a feeling of nature and kind of where Cashiers sits and what there is, the beauty of the area. So the history of the Cashiers Historical Society, they came up with and used old historical photographs, talked about the Zachary Talbot House, which is kind of their showpiece that you can visit over here if you haven't. It's a beautiful structure there that they've been able to preserve. And then the history of Cashiers, I think that took the longest, if I remember, to get created. It went through a lot of different iterations to kind of get it where they wanted it, because it's turned out to be a really large section of the book. And so they wanted to get all the details right. And so that's gives you a sense of the place, because one thing, when I was born in Bryson City, and I grew up in Franklin and Marshall and areas just around in here. And when I was a kid, we would come to Cashiers to go to the High Hampton Inn to eat at the big dining room. That was the thing I remember the earliest, is just this massive dining room there that you would go, and the big windows everywhere, and just the food that seemed to go on forever, and made a big impression when you're 8, 10, 12 years old like that, And my aunt, great aunt, lived in Cullowhee, and she had a flower shop in Silva for a long time, and she was also a nurse. And so she would go stay with families that for the doctor that she worked for, when one would have a baby, she would stay from a few days to a few weeks, depending on what they needed and all. So my mother would come back to visit her often and bring us up here, so we'd all come back up and visit over here. And she had a cabin up on Wolf Lake and some of the areas up in there. So spent a lot of time over here over the years, and just coming and hiking and visiting and stuff. So I really had not known much about the history of the area, though, so it was really enjoyable for me to do this project, to learn more about that and get into that, because I think understanding that any area that you lived, even if you just visit and come here for the summer, understanding where you are in the history of the area just gives you a better connection. You just feel more grounded to and related to where you are. And they used historical photographs. This one I did at Whiteside Mountain in the spring. Summer kind of, you can see the laurel in bloom and stuff. But it's one of the days that's kind of like today. I didn't think I was going to get much because it was overcast and raining, but it kind of broke off, and we've got these really nice clouds kind of surrounding everything, and just gives it kind of a more of a mystical kind of feel to it, rather than a sunny postcard kind of look. And so I try to come up with something different that has more of an emotion or a mood to it, not something that's just literal, like you would get with a postcard picture. And the Zachary Talbot House, and it's a pretty straightforward kind of rendition of it, but one of the beautiful things about it is it's black and white, white with black shutters, and so it makes a great black and white photograph. So, and this is the village green, including one of the kind of the sculptures there, showing the setting. It's a very busy place, it's visually, and there's a lot going on. So as a photographer, what you've got to realize is you're taking a three-dimensional world and collapsing it to 2 dimensions, and so you lose that feeling of depth sometimes and that perspective, and things overlap. So you need to kind of add simple areas to a busy photograph. So in this case, it's the path and a little bit of greenery here, so that when you go into these areas that there's a lot of interest and stuff going on, it gives your eye a place to come back to and to rest and kind of to explore the photograph. Similar kind of thing here, just adding lines that of both the road and the little wall there, kind of has a sweep to the photograph to lead your attention into the house. And then this one, I guess, one of the first ones I did over the years, and this was done out of the front porch of the cabin where they lived. I think his grandfather did some work on the place originally, and he did landscaping work, I believe, for part of what he did for a living. But they had children that were raised here, and I think one of them's involved with the Historical Society today. But I just thought it was a very nice portrait of them, trying to find them in a relaxed setting, and out on the front porch was one of the things that you'll see kind of recurring theme is porches in what I do, because I really think that's where people spend a lot of time, and feel comfortable. And this is kind of the house from a different angle without people. So that's what I would tend to do, is do both a portrait of the people, but then again, you're not showing all the different elements of the house, and then try to do a different photograph that would give more of a perspective of the house. In some cases, again, I'm not trying to make a literal portrait of a place that shows all the different features. But to me, one of the things that struck me about this place is how it fit in the woods. It's grown up around, and it just is isolated in there. And so it's not a picture of like, here's the architecture of this building, as much as here's how this building fits into the landscape. Here's how it looks and feels to me when I drive up there, as this little cabin nestled, right into the woods and into the landscaping. And then here is how it's presented in the book with their name, and then some pull quote that's pulled out to kind of catch your attention, and then the oral history interview. In most cases, they're telling a story of their life or something about the structure. We tried to kind of vary it, and that's one advantage of me doing it all, is I can tell when I'm starting to get repetitive, when people are telling me a similar story, and I'll kind of guide the conversation into something different, so that it's not all people talk about the same thing or the same aspect of growing up here and sharing the same stories. Jewel Coward of the Norton Community Center building, and it's all the different, here it's a very simple building. There's not a whole lot to photographically, so having him have this old photograph of the building to show kind of what it used to look like, and then just using all of these shapes to kind of add to the interest. So what I'm trying to do is repeat all of these squares here with this, and also have the different lines that run through it, so that graphically it makes it a very interesting thing from really a very simple situation. So that's a lot of what I have to deal with as I go into something cold, and I've got to look around and come up with, where'd I put the person's, what's interesting here, that sort of thing. And here what I did was just have them offset so that their heads are isolated against a plain part of the background. They're not overlapping with the building, but they're dressed kind of appropriately in black and white. And then I use a little fill flash to kind of add light into the faces, kind of brighten that up a little bit from a technical standpoint. But I try to make it look natural. I don't try to make things where they look like a flash picture or something like that. But from a technical standpoint, in most cases, I'm always using some kind of auxiliary lighting to do the photographs, even outdoors. And then it's just a matter of shooting enough pictures and hoping that you get something good. And that's one thing that's nice about digital versus the film. For years, I would just have to shoot all this extra film to make sure I got something good, and you never knew until you processed the film. With digital, I can sit there while they're still there, and I can review the images and see, not the fine details, but at least I got something, and I can kind of walk away feeling like I've got something I can edit together later, or maybe I need to come back and do something a little different or move them around or whatever. And this is inside the house. There's not a lot of furnishings in the house, but there's 2 rooms that have furnishing kind of up front. And these are things that he remembered playing with when he was a child, and games and such, and they have books there. And there's very little natural light in there because of the way it sits. So this is with a flash in this room. There's a couple of flashes set up in the back room, to kind of light that up so you can see there is more going on back there. And just more of a still life. One of the things that I really love about the place is just the sense of the light in there and getting the natural light. This is augmented with flash a little bit, but to kind of fill in the shadows. But basically it's just a still life picture of things kind of in the corner of one of the bedrooms. These are 2 sisters, Sandy Bryson and Frida McCall at the Lombard Lodge. And you can see the little dog out at the end out there. He kind of adds a little interest and one more little point of focus back there. And again, I want to try to emphasize them, but also give a sense of where they are. And by placing them up front and off to the side a little bit, and then having everything kind of lead away from them, it just adds a little bit more of a dynamic thing, rather than just doing a portrait of their head shots or something of that nature. And normally what I try to do is offset people a little bit. I rarely center people or center objects in the frame. It just makes it too static. So in most cases I'm putting things off to the right or the left or high or low in the frame. And the other idea from a photographic standpoint is to make your eye wander around, not just go to the center and stop, which is typically what you do in a portrait, especially like a studio portrait. It's just the eyes, because when we look at people, we look at the eyes first, and that's what we do. That's how we respond as humans. And we do that with animal pictures too. We subconsciously look at the eyes. And so that's one way you can use to kind of, create interest and keep people's eyes as if you were moving around the photograph. And again, I just like the graphics of this. That's the Lombard Lodge where they are. They're on that side porch you can see kind of here, but just having the roads that lead into it and Whiteside in the background. And this fellow, Jimmy McCall, used to work here before it became the Cedar Creek Club, and it was privately owned, and they would go around and work the yards and do the landscaping, things like that. And his brother I've also photographed in this project as well at the High Hampton. But since he gardened and did work like that for the years, I kind of found an area where it seemed to fit, where all these plants were growing, and you still see the structure and stuff. And I did pictures of the outside of the building, but this is more about him in this natural landscape that he would have, at that point in his young life, would have helped create on this lady's property that owned this. And then over here at Alexander Gardens that you pass coming into town, and I had Marilyn kind of sit off to the side there, just where her head's against the dark area of the background, so it's simplified with all these woods that are going on, and then kind of looking into the photograph. You probably all at some point or another, if you live here any length of time, I've stopped down and talked to Slick at his little antique place down there that he had for years. Great inside stuff. I really like the inside of the building and all, and I did some pictures of kind of all sorts of different things. Usually I try to do 2 to 3 different setups when I'm somewhere, and ultimately I'll decide later which one I like the best. In this case, I just liked him sitting out front of the shop with kind of all the stuff around. And Marvin has a tree farm up on the mountain, and went up there and photographed him up there, and it's just, kind of, this was my interpretation of all these trees just kind of going off into the distance, that they spend years kind of growing these to maturity. Very late afternoon. This is just natural light, just real late afternoon light. And then this is kind of the overall of the farm itself. And again, I'm trying to find shapes that stand out, and a composition where there's things happening at different parts of the frame nothing really centered again, just trying to kind of frame so the eye kind of wanders around and looks at the landscape. And then he and his wife back in one of the little houses that they have on the property. And kind of the namesake of the library here, it's Barbara Carlton at her place. And they had these signs up there. They had properties in Texas and in Florida, so they had these signs up there that would say how far it was to their Texas place or something like that, which is kind of interesting. I mean, 1,000 miles it was. But she was I guess a nurse here for her career, best I remember. Worked for one of the doctors and then did a lot of other stuff as well. But she and her daughter developed some property here. That's probably, I guess, still the case. But again, she has a wonderful home. I did some inside shots, but I ended up liking this one of her on the steps where I could really kind of show all the rock and stone combined with the timbers and the shingles and all that kind of stuff to show this natural place kind of built in from natural materials. And the McKee properties, Ann Austin was one of the people I worked with the Historical Society, and her brothers William and Lyndon. And Lyndon came in and we all three sat down. I did interviews with them kind of as a family. And then, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks after this was photographed, maybe a little longer, William had a heart attack and died out riding his bicycle with a group of people. So I was kind of glad to get them all three together as a family, because I had not seen many photographs of them as a group. But this was just in front of their property over here on the highway. Wild Hog Band, Logan Queen and Benny Queen. Benny's Logan's dad, and then Kelly Smith, they all played together for years and years. Wanted to get a picture of them, so we ended up going over to the park and doing one there downtown with their instruments. And here again at the High Hampton, what I wanted to do is do a shot of Will McKee. And so I went in and set all of this up because his time availability was pretty limited. And they were going to open the dining hall in about 30 minutes, after I shot this. So they were still dressing the room and everything. So I got them to finish the stuff up front here. And then we opened all of the blinds up all the way down through there to get as much light as we could as possible. I still had to add lighting in a little bit to kind of add into the shadows. And I had a kind of a stand-in sit there. One of the waiters kind of sat there, and I composed the shot and did my test shots and stuff. So when he got there, basically he just kind of sat down and I did the shots, and he was on his way. But I still got what I wanted, which is, And so I found a position where there's a leading line that goes down through there. Again, to simplify the setup, because there's so much going on, you just have this leading line going down, him off to one side from a kind of a composition standpoint. And this is Camp Marywood. My niece who's here just dropped off her daughters there this week, right? Yeah. So this is Sally Peterkin. Her dad started the camp, and then she runs the little restaurant over here, Cornucopia, or did, I guess. I'm not sure what the situation is today, but anyway, that's what she was doing. But she went over to the camp with me. In between when it's operation, I guess it was between camps or it was after the season, we went over there and she sat on the dock. And I tried to get just a shot showing some of the features of the place to give you a sense of, so it's not just a portrait of her, but a portrait in this environment, this natural environment. That's why people go there. They go there to get in the water, to have fun, to stay in the cabins. So I want to kind of show all of those elements to what's involved in a summer camp and still make it a portrait. Bill Hooper I photographed over at his home, and he just had this big wood pile that he had made himself, chopped up all the wood and stuff. So I got him out there with the axe, and after I kind of showed up on a day when he forgot I was going to be there. I think he'd been out there working the woods, so I just kind of took advantage of it and got him to sit there and do photographs of him there, and you can see his old barn in the background. And Carol and David brought over a old book from Western Carolina archives that showed kind of some of the store ledgers and stuff where people paid for different kinds of things. And there was a lot of gold mining originally in Cashiers Valley, of course. So it was records of that. And also they went over and brought this. You can see they got the white gloves on. They brought it out of the archive collection at Western. And we set it up there and did a portrait of them because they were doing a lot of kind of research along those lines. And Dixie lived in what was called the Woodvin Watson house. Got a picture of her kind of sitting on the front porch. She'd lived there for most of her life, and the interior was really neat. But I really kind of just liked all the decoration and the benches and things on the front porch, and just the light, airy feel that it had from the light bouncing up. Because the way they built this, and have the trees out here, you get all this indirect light, but you're not getting direct sunlight where you're having to sit there, especially on days like we've had this last week or two. And then Caney had a little fishing cabin that these members have a fishing club, and they take turns coming up and spending a week with their family here. And I think there used to be about 25 members, something like that, and they would just alternate weeks, and they would come up and restock the rivers and streams and stuff. So he was very active in the fishing world. And then Carlton Layton, talked to you about earlier, that then Jane Nardi, who wrote a lot of books about the area, a lot of the history of the area, things like that, at the Cole Tate house, and photographed her. And I just, again, found the situation first and then put her into the chair, because I just liked all the lines and everything that was going on. And a lot of it's just subtle movements of an inch here, an inch there, to keep things from overlapping in shapes and all, to kind of simplify things. And then having her kind of right up front for the portrait. And then Whiteside Cove School, it was also today, it's called the Summer Chapel, I think, because they have the services there in the summer. They'll set up a tent outside and have services, kind of overflow services out there. But I really like this, one of my favorite portraits, because he has a really wonderful face, but also just the space. This combined space. It's been a church, it's been a school, it's been a community center, it's been kind of a little of everything. And it's just this beautiful structure, but it's so simplistic. It's almost Amish or Mennonite or something like that in the sparsity of it, but the simplicity of it, really like. And Charlie managed the community center, and there wasn't a lot. It was a fairly modern building, so I didn't have as much to work with. So what I decided to do is try to get some feeling of activity. So they had a basketball game going on in the background. So I had him hold really still for like a half a second or 1 second exposure, and then just let them blur in the background to show that there was activity happening there. And so he was very patient for me to, to try to hold still. There's a lot of shots where he blinked or blurred or something like that, but I did enough to where I finally, came up with one shot that it really was probably just one shot where everything kind of worked, where he had a good expression, sharp eyes, and activity going on in the background room. And Janice, I photographed over at the Hanks house. I think her mother worked there originally. Maybe she did when she was younger. But I just really liked the room there and all the ornate old furnishings and things. And Carol McCall, I saw you earlier, and Carol was a caddy when he was growing up at the High Hampton when he was 12 years old, 14 years old, something like that. And the boys would show up and they would put their name on the board, and then the families would come down to play golf, and they would take whoever was the next caddy. And some he would end up caddying with for the whole summer, because when people came back then, they stayed for the summer. They didn't stay a week or a weekend or something like that. They would come and spend the summer here. And so he would get to be friends. In almost every case, it was a husband and wife that would come. And he said they didn't even keep score in most cases. It was just about exercise and getting out there. It was not a competitive kind of thing. I'm sure it was in some sense, but he said, I don't even remember, most of the time we didn't even keep score. They just went out and played to get outside and have a round with another couple, and usually it's 2 or 3 couples that would play together. But they still have some of the old clubs and stuff there in the little room. And this is from the High Hampton, just looking over the lake. And Jean Rappel, the whole Cashier School, and she was taught at the school when she was younger and went to school. And a lot of these buildings have been repurposed today. They're no longer what they originally were, but we're lucky that many of them are still standing, even if they're, a business now or something, or an office or something different. This is a case as well. This is now an antique shop, but James, the father's seating, he worked for the Blue Ridge Parkway as an information officer, did a lot of work, wrote for the newspapers, and did a lot of editorial work over the years. And I knew him in that capacity. I'd met him back in the 80s once we finally figured out. It's kind of funny to realize that we had contact back then on a different, when I was working for a magazine doing articles. He was a kind of public information officer.
How did you get those guys' mouths to go that way?
To get a what?
Look at the mouth. You said look at the eyes, but
Yeah.
look at the mouth.
Father and son.
One of them goes this way, one goes that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of it is, there's so much subtlety to the human face, and that's one thing that you realize when you do portraiture, is you can shoot, let's say it was film days, you'd shoot 36 pictures, and you would be lucky to get one or two that really were representative of that person. And you would, the person themselves I might find 15 or 12 or 15 I liked, and then if you showed it to the person, they might only find one or two because they're very critical of how they look and what looks natural and things like that. So ultimately, I have to make the decision, but I do want them to be pleased with it. But it's kind of ultimately up to me to decide what I think is typical of both of them, or a good portrait of both. Or the more people add, the harder it is to kind of get a good shot of everybody. The husband and wife, John and Marcia Picarli, and they would take backpacks and put these little trees, I think they were red spruce, they put them in the back of the backpack and hike them to the top of the mountain and try to repopulate it. And they planted like 500 trees doing that by this point, and trying to repopulate the mountain with these native trees that originally would grow up there. So they would take this multi-mile hike up to the top. And then chimney top from the Sapphire Valley Golf Course. And that's one of the spectacular things, of course, of this area, Western North Carolina in general, but the Cashier Valley especially, is just these beautiful, in many cases, bald-faced mountains, but just these wooded peaks, real severe, unique shapes. You look down through the valley and you've got these domes, you've got pinnacles, you've got all these wonderful shapes of the different mountains on both sides of the valley. It's really unique. And the Chateau Club, this was a croquet court that they had built, and they spent all this time bringing hundreds of dump truckloads full of clay and dirt and stuff to put in here to build this, again, kind of sitting in this natural landscape. And Bessie Moses lived in a place called Mountaintop. It was a kind of a family home. It was kind of an unusual architecture for a cabinet. Kind of had an L-shaped kind of wing onto it. But I just really liked the windows to these old cabins. I think there's something that you probably would go to an antique store or a salvage place and find them today because they were taken out of places like this. But fortunately, they're still there. At least for her place, they were. And Kevin was at the Orchard restaurant today, but it used to be called the Hawkins Miniature House. And so I photographed him. He has an antique shop here on the highway, but this was back over at the Orchard restaurant. Just got him kind of seated on the front because it was closed up at the time, and just kind of in that environment. And Dick Jennings, when he was a boy, his father or his grandfather owned a lot of the land here, and he had a hotel here, and he would come down to stay with him in the summer, and he would give him a shotgun and a horse and mare, and he would just wander through the mountains. And everybody kind of knew who his grandfather was, so they'd take him in, feed him lunch and everything. And I thought, he told me all these stories, like, what a wonderful childhood to come down here and just ride through the mountains, back in the 1930s and 40s, and have the kind of the whole place to yourself. Today, he and his sons run that Lonesome Valley Farm, and it's a development, but they spend a lot of time trying to keep, very low impact housing over just a very small portion of the land. His daughter runs the Sunburst Trout Company over there in Sunburst. But a really interesting, neat fella. Had a big lumber company, Jennings Lumber, one of the big businesses here for many years. Mary Bryson, I went over here and I just really looked around first because it was late in the afternoon trying to find an interesting place to seat her. And I just really liked all the different shapes, all the different triangles and the way the shadows made different shapes and just multiple triangles everywhere. But then I picked her kind of a dark spot for her background so that she would stand out among all this kind of busy stuff. And Gene Howard over at the Sapphire Club, or Sapphire Valley Club, just kind of out on the golf course. And here again, just trying to find interesting shapes and patterns, to lead your eye around, counterpoints between the people in the mountains so that your eye moves back and forth, kind of setting up a triangular kind of composition between different elements in there. So you can take something simple and try to, make it a little bit more interesting. And then I love the interiors of spaces, especially the churches. I'm a sucker for that, I think. And this was just a beautiful setting. And so I got Steve to kind of stand outside, did some shots of him outside the chapel, but also I did ones inside. And I like these the best of what I did. And then that's outside of the same building. And when you photograph architecture, one of the difficulties is if you don't shoot the camera perfectly level, then you get what's called a keystoning effect, where the building starts to look like it's wedge-shaped or falling over. And it happens especially in the pictures you see of New York City or something like that. But it happens even with others. So I'm always having to try to figure out what is a good foreground so I can shoot level instead of tilting the camera up. So that's kind of at the upper edge of the frame. So trying to find an interesting foreground, in this case the rhododendron and the path and the leaves and all kind of add an interesting foreground so that I don't have to tilt the camera up to get the whole building in. And then that's kind of how it was used in the book. You have the structure, you have the interior shot, and you have the oral history together. Another still life that was used on the back of it. And then this is the Highlands Commission that I did, I mentioned earlier, where I went over there and did 8 people in places. And these are 4 of them from the Playhouse to people's interiors and their landscapes to the hardware store on Main Street. And then the other 4. All right, questions before I ramble on? Yes.
When you were talking about the effect that you would get the foreground when the church picture,
Mm-hmm. Right.
I probably should ask right then. But can you then go and crop if you don't want that and still have that same, not the steepled effect? I think you called it a steepled effect. You compared it to the city of New York or...
Right. Yeah, you can. Normally with wide angle lenses, to get the less distortion, then you just shoot it as level as possible. And now in a natural landscape, it doesn't matter because there's no straight lines in nature. So it doesn't matter if something looks skewed or it does, you won't notice it because everything bends, all the trees and things like that. But when you get into a building and you try to photograph the interior, let's say the doorway will sometimes look like what's called a barrel distortion. It'll look curved because of the way it's distorted by the wide angle lens thing. So the more you can shoot level with something with your wide angle lens, the more you can minimize that kind of effect. But to do that, the top half of the picture is what you're wanting, but now you have the bottom half of the picture you've got to fill with something interesting too. So that's a matter of kind of finding interesting foregrounds to use so you can still kind of shoot level.
Tim,
Yes.
can I add something?
Yeah.
Photoshop.
Today you can straighten perspective a little bit with that. Yeah. But
You do such a fantastic job. I'm an old newspaper man.
okay.
And I use film. I
Right.
learned how to use film to take pictures. I have a weekly newspaper newspaper, so you had to do everything, you know, you had to take a picture and a copy and crop it. You know, you just, what I've always, what I was taught, you know, that you want the picture to tell a story.
Right.
And you've done that so well.
Oh, thank you.
Quite proud of you.
Thank you. I know when I was working on the Face of Appalachia book, which if we got time, I'll show you a few images from some of the others, but you know, when I did one of my exhibits at the Folk Art Center in Asheville years ago, I had text panels that would go up with the photograph and talk about it. And when I was coming up, you were told that the only time you use text with photographs if your photographs weren't good enough, you know, so it was kind of supplemented. But I really felt like, you know, when I was shooting the view camera and I would go out and do an interview with somebody and photograph them, it would be literally weeks before I got the sheet film processed and proofs made, anything to show to somebody, you know. And so, but I had the conversation I could relate, and they were fascinated by the conversation just as I was. So they said, well, we probably won't put the text panels up. I said, well, what's it gonna hurt? You either put them up or you don't. People read them or they won't. And when I went back over there a few weeks later, they said, I'm so glad we did this. We've had people come back 2 or 3 times just to read everything, you know. And so I think the more you can do to kind of, you know, make these people accessible, share that story, because we're storytellers as humans. We're, you know, from your profession, you know, that's what we do. You know, in one form or another, is we share information through stories. That's how we learn what to avoid or things that might be dangerous or, you know, what's fun to do. I mean,
What you've done so well is making people relax. You know, I used to have, when I was taking a picture, people breath.
Yeah.
So I would have someone to stand right by me and talk to them. That way they'd start talking to you and everything else. So
Yeah.
relax.
Yeah,
You got that real well.
good. All right, if you'll bear with me, I'll quick through a couple of things here to kind of show you. This is the Face of Appalachia book, and this is the camera I'm talking about. I'd use different versions of this, but it's an old 4x5 view camera where you know, you're looking at a ground glass on the back with a magnifier to focus, and you're focusing by changing the draw of the bellows, and the lens is out on the front. That's how you change lenses. And you have a separate light meter, and the film is in sheets and holders, one on each side, and you have to load them up in the darkroom the night before, and it's a whole rigmarole. But you know, it gives you really wonderful photographs. So one of the exhibits I did was over at Western Carolina years ago, and they wanted to put up 3 huge prints up above the main part of the gallery. And they wanted 4 by 6 feet, which I was very opposed to doing. But one of my friends was the one that was in charge of making the prints for this. He worked for the state archives. I went over there and worked with him. And when I got to figure it out, the ratio to blow it up that big was the same as taking a 35 millimeter negative and making an 8 by 10 print. You know, the negative, you know, how much you enlarged it was the same. So they look great, especially like billboards you see. They're taken from regular files. But because of the distance that they are, the proper viewing distance, you don't see all the pixels and the flaws in them until you get right up on it, you know. So we end up doing that, and they look great, you know. So these are just photographs I've done, mostly of farmers and their families. This fellow had a one-legged chicken that you can see it's missing a leg, and he told me that it got caught on a piece of tin and that he had cut it off. And he had to feed it by hand because it couldn't scratch. And I showed this to my stepfather for multiple times, and he finally said, real quiet man, he finally said, you know, he was a cockfighter. Probably lost his leg in the cockfight. I said, oh, okay, so this whole big story he had was just for my benefit. And my stepfather took me to visit this fellow. They grew up together. This fellow's father could not support him, and his mother died, and he gave him away pretty much to their family to come work for them, starting when he was about 12 years old. And they grew up together, and he, you know, lived in a one-room place down on the river between the railroad track and the river. And these were his prized things on the wall was Johnny Cash and June Carter and Jesus Christ. And this lady, I photographed her son a number of times, and she was always there but kind of stayed in the background. And he was off, he was a farmer, but like most, he had to do something else for a living, so he was a long-haul truck driver, and he was gone. And so I always would take photographs back and give them to people as a way of saying thank you. And I came back, and she didn't say anything. I said, well, okay, here's the pictures for John, and laid them on the porch and started to walk away. And she came back out and says, this is what I do. And she started pulling all these quilts out and stuff like that, just kind of draped them around her. And I said, okay, well, I'll bring photographs back when I come. She said, I'd rather have fabric. I said, okay. my ego can take that, I think, you know. But anyway, so I went and I took her photographs too, but I went and got this big bag for like $10 or $15 of scraps at the foam and fabric place, you know, and took her this big thing because she couldn't drive, she couldn't get out anywhere to get fabric, and she wanted material that she could work with. And this is from the cover of the book. This guy, his doctor told him to slow down. So his idea of slowing down was got rid of his horses and mules and would plow with his steer. He taught the steer how to plow. His name was Barry. And I swear he could understand other than just G and haw, you know, right and left, he could understand because I would have the camera set up and I'd pull the dark side out and get ready to take a picture. And it's all around. He goes, okay, Barry, look at the camera. He swing his head right up at me. And it's like, bam. You know?
Is that tobacco?
It is, yeah. So it's in a tobacco field where the harvest time, they're sledding the tobacco to the barn in this particular day. But here, you know, to make him look even bigger, he's a massive animal, but to make him look even bigger, I put him real close up to the frame and then had Collie farther back in the distance and a little lower down in the field. And then I played up kind of this line of the rope and then the lines of the field, so everything has this kind of wedge and it gives a sense of going smaller to larger, and that helps emphasize the size difference there as well. And this fellow I just photographed, photographed this farm, and he came walking out to check his mailbox. I'm sure he was trying to wonder what I was doing is why he came out. But I talked to him very briefly, which is unusual. And then I had this in the exhibit at the Folk Art Center, and his daughter came up to me and said, you know, we always loved that photograph. And I said, well, you know, I just really regret not being able to ever interview your dad. She goes, oh, he's 99, you can still alive, you want to come talk to him? I said, I'd love to. And she said, well, maybe sooner rather than later. I said, okay, I can do that. So I went over there about 3 weeks later and photographed him and interviewed him. He lived to be 100. And then this lady and her husband's outside talking to this kind of, her great aunt, or her aunt was kind of bedridden at that point in the little cabin that they had there. She was tending to her. And Peggy, the one that's sitting on the right, she worked at the Appalachian room at Mars Hill College, so she kind of understood what I was about, what I was doing and things, even though we'd never met before, but she allowed me to kind of come into this very personal situation and set up lights and a camera and all this kind of stuff that you, I went back recently to the farm to do something else for a YouTube thing, and went in this little room, and I can't even believe, I must have been standing in the doorway, almost out in the hall, because I don't know how else I would have gotten that photograph. The room is so small. And then this is one of the things that I just kind of saw my rearview mirror driving up this road one day, kind of between Madison and Yancey County, and my wife Catherine and I went by there last week, and all of this is grown up. You cannot see any of this. It's just trees, the whole thing. Nothing's being tilled. It doesn't been farmed anymore. But you can get up to the top of the mountain and still kind of see this beautiful thing. And then river baptism that I did, which is really just a creek culvert where it comes under the road. They just dam it up with a backhoe and make a puddle out of it. And I went back last year and photographed the same scene. They're still doing this. They made a conscious decision not to build a baptismal pool in the new church. They still do it on their decoration day. And then this is two cousins. The one on the left is deaf, and so her cousin's the only one out of the family that had learned sign language, so she would come stay with her in the summer, and they just became fast friends because they both could sign with each other. And molasses making, I went back and filmed that as one of my videos on the YouTube recently. Spent a couple of days with them doing molasses making, use these old horse-drawn mills. 1 horsepower. So I'll kind of just flip through some of these others because I know we're over time, but these are just pictures from the owners for a Brow book, which was kind of the follow-up to that, apple picking, and then the Hands in Harmony, which has a music CD, but it's Ralph Stanley and his grandson Ralph III up at their house in Virginia, and a ballad singer named Deli Norton. So a lot of artists and craftspeople, and then the oral histories come with that. And then my guidebooks on the Parkway, and with that, the kind of the component of identifying the mountain peaks, which is the hardest thing I think I've ever tried to do. It took me 5 years to get all this done, figure all this out, learn map reading and how to do all this. And that's what my map looked like when I got done with it. plotting all the different points from the viewpoints to the mountain peaks. And the mother treed the cubs, and everybody was trying to get pictures. And I used my real long lens to do this. And people, oh, that's so cute. And they're walking over there, and they're going, well, yeah, the reason she treat them is because she's afraid you're going to do something. So, but I just made sure that at least there was more people in front of me, between me and the mother, than behind, that I could outrun, as the joke goes. But anyway, so whole different approach, whole different kind of thing, but just kind of guidebooks and, you know, going. Some of, you know, were images that I used for years of photographing for publicity for, you know, the train cutting in, you know, rafting companies and different things like that. I was able to kind of reuse those photographs in the books, to do the guidebook. And then Carlton Valley, you realize how small that is when you do aerial photography there. Cades Cove, I don't know how many of you have been to Cades Cove, but that's what it looks like from the air. And the 11-mile loop road runs along the outside of the valley floor through there, and then Abrams Creek down through the middle. And another view in Cades Cove. And then done a lot of work on the coast. I like going down there. We vacation down there a lot around Beaufort, South Carolina, and Hunting Island, and then architecture. Okay. I think that's all the pictures I have, but I'll be glad to answer questions. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out, and be sure to check out the Cashier's book while you're here. If you want to see any of my other books, you can pick up. I just brought one copy for review. If you want to pick up and look through anything, you're welcome to look at any of those. And a couple of people had some questions for afterwards. I'll be available. All right. Thanks for coming.